At my wedding rehearsal, my parents demanded that I remove Grandpa from the head table. He's just a retired janitor. He embarrasses us. I refused, so they walked out. But at the reception, Dad's CEO stood, turned to Grandpa, and said 4 words that wiped the confidence from Dad's face. My mom said it in the hallway outside my rehearsal dinner, quiet enough that the caterers wouldn't hear, sharp enough that I'd never forget it. If Walter sits at the head table, your father and I will not attend your wedding. I was 28 years old, 14 hours from getting married, and my mother was asking me to choose between the man who raised me and the 2 people who happened to share my blood. Then don't come, I said. My dad's jaw did the thing it always did when he wasn't getting his way. That slow tightening, like he was grinding something down to dust behind his teeth. You're choosing him over your own parents. I'm choosing decency over cruelty. They left without saying goodbye. I stood in that hallway in my rehearsal dress, mascara threatening, and I didn't cry. I want that on record. I didn't cry because some small cold part of me had known this was coming for 20 years. Let me back up. My grandfather's name is Walter Brooks. He is 74 years old, 5'9", with hands like old leather and a laugh that used to shake the walls of our kitchen when I was a kid. For 31 years, he was the head custodian at Redwood Elementary and later Kensington Middle School. He mopped hallways, fixed jammed lockers, and kept a tin of peppermints in his left jacket pocket that he refilled every single week from the discount bin at the drugstore on 5th. My parents call him a retired janitor, said the way you'd describe a stain you can't quite get out of the carpet. I call him the reason I made it to 28 at all. My parents, David and Carol Whitfield, are not bad people in the cartoon sense. They don't yell, they don't hit. What they do is worse in a slower way. They measure everything by what it looks like from the outside. My dad runs a mid-sized commercial insurance brokerage, the kind that survives by getting invited to the right golf outings and sitting at the right dinner tables. My mom curates our family the way other people curate an Instagram feed, for optics, for approval, for the appearance of a life going exactly according to plan. Grandpa didn't fit the feed. He never had. When I was 7 and broke my arm falling off the jungle gym, it was Grandpa who drove 40 minutes from the middle school on his lunch break because my parents were both in meetings. When I was 14 and got my heart broken for the first time, it was Grandpa who sat with me on his porch with 2 mugs of instant hot chocolate and said, "This one hurt because it was real. That's not nothing." When I was 19 and the financial aid letter came back short, $4,000 short, the kind of gap that ends college dreams for a lot of kids, it was Grandpa who wrote me a check from his pension without blinking. The same month, my parents leased my mother a new BMW because the old one, in her words, wasn't reflecting well. I never forgot that math. I don't think I ever will. There were other entries in that ledger, small ones, the kind that don't seem like much until you stack enough of them side by side. When I was 11 and got cut from the travel soccer team, my parents were at a client dinner and didn't hear about it until the next morning over eggs, distracted, already halfway into their phones. Grandpa picked me up that same afternoon, saw my face before I said a word, and took me to the batting cages instead, because he said sometimes you needed to hit something that couldn't hit you back. When I graduated high school, my parents made the ceremony, barely, arriving during the processional, leaving before the reception because my dad had an early flight, but Grandpa had been in the parking lot 2 hours early, camera in hand, so nervous about missing my name being called that he'd asked 3 different staff members exactly where our row would be seated. When my first serious boyfriend in college left me for someone else with a text message, of all things, a single paragraph sent at 1 a.m., it was Grandpa who drove 3 hours on a Tuesday, no explanation needed beyond me saying I wasn't doing great, and sat in my dorm's common room with a bag of gas station donuts until I stopped crying long enough to laugh at how bad they tasted. None of this made it into the story my parents told about our family. In their version, they were the architects of my success, the tuition they'd helped with, the connections they'd made, the values they'd instilled. Grandpa was a footnote, a sweet old man who showed up sometimes, good for a hug at holidays, and not much else. It took me years to understand that the story they told wasn't a lie exactly. It was an edit. They had simply cut out every scene where someone else did the work of loving me, because keeping those scenes in would have meant admitting how often they hadn't. So when my mom called me over for coffee 2 days before my wedding, and I saw the seating chart already printed on her kitchen table, and I saw Grandpa's name circled in blue ink with an arrow pointing toward a table near the kitchen doors, some part of me went very still and very cold. "He shouldn't be at the head table," she said, not even looking up from her coffee. "Why?" "He's a retired janitor, Hannah. Your father's business partners will be there. Theo's whole firm will be there." My dad leaned in from where he'd been pretending to read the paper. "He embarrasses us." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to. He embarrasses us. Not he's difficult, not he causes problems, not even he doesn't get along with people. Embarrasses. As if the man's entire existence was a wardrobe malfunction they needed to correct before the cameras came out. "He talks about cleaning cafeterias like anyone wants to hear it," my dad said. "He talks about children," I said. "He talks about which kids needed extra attention that week. He talks about the little girl in 3rd period who cried every day until he started leaving her a peppermint on her desk. That's what he talks about, Dad." "He smells like a school hallway," my mom said, and I actually laughed because it was such a specific, petty, revealing thing to say, and because I knew exactly what she meant and exactly how wrong she was. "He smells like peppermints," I said. "He paid for my first year of college out of his pension. There wasn't enough money for my tuition that year, but there was enough for your car lease." "I remember the math, Mom. I've always remembered the math." My dad's face went cold in a way I recognized, the shutting down look he got right before he decided a conversation was over. Whether or not it actually was. We'll see how this plays out, he said, which from my father was as close to a threat as he ever came. That night, I found out my mother had already emailed the wedding coordinator. Move Walter to table 14 near the kitchen. Don't tell Hannah. She's authorized me to handle logistics. I had authorized no such thing. My fiance Theo, bless him, had CC'd himself on every vendor email since we got engaged, an instinct I used to think was slightly paranoid, and now understood was the smartest thing either of us had done in 18 months of planning. He forwarded me the screenshot at 11:40 p.m. with a single line. Did you approve this? I hadn't. The coordinator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya, who ran her business like a Swiss watch, wrote back within the hour. Any seating changes required sign-off from both members of the couple. Full stop, no exceptions, per the contract we'd signed in March. My mother had tried to disappear my grandfather from his own granddaughter's wedding using a scheduling email, the same way you'd reroute a delivery. And when that didn't work, she escalated to an ultimatum in a hallway, 12 hours before the ceremony. My grandfather, through all of this, said nothing to me. I didn't find out until weeks later from my aunt, who let it slip over the phone, that my mother had actually called him directly the day before the rehearsal to gently suggest he might be more comfortable at a table with some of my cousins, away from Dad's business associates. Grandpa told her he'd sit wherever I wanted him to sit, and then he hung up, and then he didn't say a single word about it to me because he didn't want me carrying his hurt on top of my own wedding stress. That's the kind of man they call an embarrassment. At the rehearsal dinner, when my parents gave me their ultimatum and I gave them my answer, they walked out into the parking lot without hugging me, without wishing me luck, without a single word to Theo. I watched my father's car pull away through the restaurant window, tail lights shrinking, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as grief with the shape cut out of it. Grief for a relationship that had never really existed the way I'd pretended it did. Grandpa found me by the coat check 10 minutes later. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew, the way he always seemed to know things without being told. You don't have to fix this tonight, he said. Weddings have a way of sorting people by what they're actually made of. Sometimes that's not comfortable to watch. They're not coming tomorrow, I said. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected exactly this and had already made peace with it somewhere along the drive over. Then I suppose I'll have to walk you myself, he said, if you'll have me. I cried for the first time that whole ugly week, right there by the coat check, into the shoulder of a rented sport coat that smelled faintly and permanently of peppermint. The morning of my wedding, the 2 front row seats reserved for my parents stayed empty through the entire ceremony. I noticed them the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue, an absence you can't stop returning to, even when you're trying not to. Grandpa walked me down the aisle instead, in a rented suit that didn't quite fit him through the shoulders, his shoes polished to a shine I suspected he'd done himself the night before, sitting on the edge of his bed with an old rag and a tin of polish, the way he'd probably done 1,000 times before school assemblies nobody thanked him for attending. Who gives this woman to be married? The officiant asked. Her grandfather does, Grandpa said, and his voice caught slightly on the word grandfather, like it was a title he was still getting used to being allowed to claim out loud, in public, in front of everyone, with everything I have. It wasn't much, materially, a pension, a 1-story house 40 minutes from Redwood Elementary, a closet of rented suits and pressed shirts. But it was, I understood as I stood there in white with my hand in his, more than my parents had ever actually given me, for all their money and all their optics and all their concern about what the room would think. At the reception, he sat at the head table, right where my parents' names used to be printed on the little calligraphed place cards. I'd had Priya reprint them myself 2 days earlier, in the middle of all that chaos. Walter Brooks, in the same careful script the coordinator had originally used for my mother's name. The room was maybe 90 minutes into dinner, glasses being refilled, my father-in-law halfway through a toast about how he'd never seen Theo laugh as much as he had since meeting me, when a woman walked in through the ballroom's side entrance. She had silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a low knot, a navy dress that probably cost more than the entire flower budget, and a way of moving through a crowded room that I can only describe as gravitational. Not loud, not performative, just entirely, quietly certain that whatever door she walked through would open for her, because it always had. Theo's hand found my arm under the table, his grip suddenly tight. That's Margaret Ellison, he whispered. That's my company's CEO. I felt my stomach do something complicated. Theo worked in commercial underwriting, a mid-level analyst 3 tiers down from anyone who'd ever exchanged more than a nodding hello with the woman who ran the whole operation. She wasn't on our guest list. I hadn't sent her an invitation. Neither, as far as I knew, had Theo, who would have mentioned inviting his CEO to our wedding roughly 400 times in the planning process, out of sheer disbelief that she'd said yes. My father had spent the better part of 6 years trying to get in front of Margaret Ellison. I knew this because he'd explained it to me, unprompted, at 3 separate Thanksgivings, the way some men explain football strategy to people who didn't ask, how her firm's board sat on the parent company that reinsured half my dad's biggest commercial accounts, how one conversation with her could reshape his entire client pipeline for a decade, how getting 5 minutes of her attention was worth more to him than almost anything else in his professional life. She didn't look at my father, who wasn't there. She didn't look at Theo, who half rose out of his chair like he might need to intercept whatever was about to happen. She walked straight past the head table's laurel centerpiece, straight past me in my wedding dress, and stopped in front of my grandfather. Walter Brooks, she said. He looked up from his plate, confused in the specific way people get confused when their name arrives from a direction it has no business coming from. That's me, he said carefully. I don't know if you remember me, she said, and something in her voice had gone soft in a way that didn't match match the navy dress or the gravitational walk or anything I'd have guessed about a woman who ran a company that size. He studied her face for a long moment, really studied it, the way I'd seen him study kids in old school photos he kept in a shoebox, trying to place a name to features that time had rearranged. Then his eyes went wide and something in his whole posture shifted, like a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had suddenly found a place to set itself down. "Maggie?" he said. She laughed, and for exactly 1 second, the CEO disappeared entirely, and standing in front of us was just a woman who'd been recognized after God knows how many years of wondering if anyone ever would. She pulled a chair over from the empty seat beside him, my mother's old seat, I realized with a jolt, and sat down. The entire head table went quiet. I saw my new mother-in-law's fork pause halfway to her mouth. I saw Theo's best man lean forward like he'd stumbled into the middle of a movie. "When I was 11, Margaret Ellison said, her hand finding my grandfather's on the white tablecloth. "My father lost his job. It was sudden, a plant closure. No warning, no severance to speak of. My mother worked nights at a hospital laundry to keep us afloat. There were weeks, more weeks than I ever told anyone about, where there wasn't money for school lunches." Grandpa's face had gone very still. "I was ashamed," she said. 11 years old and ashamed in a way I didn't have words for yet. "So instead of going to the cafeteria, I used to hide in a supply closet near the gym during lunch period. Every day. For almost 2 years. She wasn't performing this. I want to be clear about that." There was no room in her voice for an audience, even though by now half the reception had gone quiet. Waitstaff pausing mid-step near the kitchen doors, my mother-in-law's hand pressed flat against her own chest. "Someone started leaving things on the shelf in that closet," Margaret said. "A sandwich, an apple, sometimes a little carton of milk, the kind from the cafeteria line. Every single day without fail, for 2 years. You never asked me a single question about it. You never once mentioned it to a teacher where I might overhear and feel exposed. You just left the food, and you walked away, and you let me keep my dignity intact." Her voice cracked on the word dignity, and she pressed her lips together for a second before she could finish. "You saved my life, Mr. Brooks. I mean that with as much precision as I can manage. Not metaphorically. I think about those 2 years more than almost anything else that's ever happened to me, and I have spent 26 years wondering if I would ever get the chance to say thank you to the person who did that." The room was completely silent. Even the string quartet, I noticed later, had stopped between songs and simply hadn't started again. My grandfather, the man my parents called an embarrassment, the man they'd tried to move to table 14 near the kitchen doors, the man whose entire life's work they'd summarized as smelling like a hallway, sat frozen with tears running freely down his face, holding the hand of one of the most powerful executives in my father's entire industry, who was looking at him like he was the only person in that ballroom worth knowing. "I didn't know your name back then," he said finally, his voice thick. "The little girl in the gray coat. I used to worry about you on the weekends, wondered if you had enough to eat when school wasn't there to catch you." "Sylvia," Margaret said. "That was my name then. I changed it when I was 22, for reasons that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with a childhood I needed some distance from. Margaret Ellison is who I built afterward, but Sylvia is who you fed." "You did all this," Grandpa said, gesturing vaguely at her, at the dress, at the room, at the sheer improbable scale of what she'd apparently become from a supply closet. "I did all this," she said, "because someone made sure I survived long enough to try. I should tell you what was happening in me while all of this unfolded because I think it matters. I had spent 2 days being told by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally that my grandfather was a liability to be hidden, repositioned, in my mother's clinical phrasing, to a table where he wouldn't embarrass anyone. And now I was watching the exact kind of person my father had spent 6 years trying to impress, choose, out of every guest in that room, to walk directly to that supposedly embarrassing man and tell him he had saved her life. The math my parents had done, janitor equals liability, executive equals asset, had just been rewritten in front of 90 wedding guests by the executive herself, and it hadn't required a single word from me. Theo squeezed my hand under the table. I looked at him and he mouthed silently, "Are you okay?" And I realized I was crying too, though for entirely different reasons than my grandfather's tears. Margaret stayed at that table for the better part of 20 minutes. She asked Grandpa about his retirement, about whether he still kept peppermints in his pocket. He did, he told her. He showed her the tin, half embarrassed, and she laughed and said some habits should never be allowed to retire even when the man does. She asked about me, about how I'd turned out, and Grandpa told her, with more pride in his voice than I think I'd ever heard from either of my actual parents, that I'd graduated with honors, that I'd never once in my life let anyone convince me to be smaller than I was, that I reminded him sometimes of the kids who used to come back years later just to say the peppermints had mattered more than they probably should have. At some point, one of the other guests at the head table, an older cousin of Theo's, a partner at some regional law firm, leaned over and asked Margaret, half joking, half genuinely curious, how exactly she'd known Walter would be here tonight. "I didn't," she said simply. Theo mentioned weeks ago in passing that his fiance's grandfather was a retired school custodian named Walter, walking her down the aisle instead of her father. It's not a common enough name that I didn't wonder. I asked which schools. When he said Redwood Elementary, I knew before he finished the sentence. "I've been trying to find this man for over 2 decades, Mr. Whitfield here at insurance conferences notwithstanding." That last part landed with a small, cold clarity for me, because I understood, watching the way she said my father's surname, flat, unhurried, without a flicker of the recognition he'd spent 6 years angling for, that she had known exactly who David Whitfield was this entire time. She simply hadn't cared, not out of malice, out of indifference, the specific kind that only comes from someone who has never once needed to keep track of who's trying to get close to her. The rest of the reception took on a strange, hushed energy after that, the way a room does after something genuinely unscripted happens in the middle of an otherwise choreographed event. I noticed my new mother-in-law refilling Grandpa's water glass without being asked, something she hadn't done for anyone else at the table all night. I noticed Theo's best man, the lawyer cousin, and two of my own college friends drift past the head table over the next hour on manufactured errands, a forgotten napkin, a question about the dessert table, just to get a better look at the man everyone was suddenly, quietly re-evaluating. I noticed the DJ, of all people, lean over to Priya at one point and ask, in a stage whisper I wasn't meant to hear, who that old guy was that the CEO lady had been crying with. Margaret stayed until the cake was cut. Before she left, she found me near the gift table, alone for a moment while Theo made his rounds, and she took both my hands in hers, the same way she'd taken Grandpa's. He talks about you, she said. Even in those 20 minutes, mostly what he wanted to talk about was you, not himself, not what happened between us all those years ago. You. She paused, studying my face the way I'd watched her study his. People like that don't come along often. Whatever it cost you to make sure he had that seat tonight, I hope you already know it was worth it. I told her I did. I meant it more in that moment than I had at any point over the previous 2 exhausting days. For what it's worth, she added, glancing back toward the head table, where Grandpa was now showing my new father-in-law the tin of peppermints like it was a small, sacred object. The people who tried to keep him out of that seat did you a favor in the end. They showed you exactly who they are, the week it mattered most. Most people don't get that clarity handed to them for free. That last part landed with a small, cold clarity for me, because I understood in that moment that this coincidence had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with the specific geometry of small towns and long memories, that my father's years of trying to engineer his way into a room with Margaret Ellison had failed completely, while my grandfather had already been in that room, waiting without knowing it, simply by being exactly who he'd always been. I don't know exactly when word reached my father. I know it wasn't from me. I didn't call him that night, and I haven't fully forgiven myself for how satisfying it felt not to. What I do know is that within a week, my aunt told me, in the careful voice she used whenever she was passing along something she knew would hurt, that my father had heard about Margaret Ellison's visit to my wedding through an industry contact who'd heard about it from someone at Theo's firm, and that he'd gone quiet at dinner the night he found out, and that my mother had asked him 3 times what was wrong before he finally told her. I don't know what was in his face when he heard it. I wasn't there. Some part of me still, even now, imagines it. The exact moment my father, who'd spent 6 years chasing 5 minutes with that woman, learned that she'd spent 20 minutes at a head table with a man he'd tried to banish to the seats near the kitchen, and that she'd done it for reasons that had nothing to do with him at all, in a room he'd chosen to skip out of pride. 3 months after the wedding, my mother called me. It was the first time either of my parents had reached out since the rehearsal dinner. She didn't apologize, not really. My mother's apologies have always arrived wrapped in explanation, softened at the edges until they barely resemble an apology at all. But she asked in a smaller voice than I'd heard from her in years, whether Grandpa was doing all right, whether he'd mentioned anything about that night, whether I thought he'd ever want to see them again. I told her the truth. I told her Grandpa didn't hold grudges the way other people did, that he'd told me a few weeks after the wedding, sitting on his porch with 2 mugs of decaf because the doctor had cut him off caffeine, that he genuinely hoped my parents would come around eventually, not for his sake, but for mine, because family shouldn't have to be earned back one grand gesture at a time. I told her that didn't mean the door was open on her terms, on her schedule, whenever it was convenient for her optics to include him again. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if I thought my father would ever get another shot with Margaret Ellison's firm. I hung up the phone and sat with that for a while, because it told me something I think I'd known all along and just hadn't wanted to fully admit, that even after everything, even after watching her own father-in-law wiped clean of confidence at his own daughter's wedding by 4 words she still wouldn't ask me directly about. My mother's first real question wasn't about repair. It was about access. I did eventually learn what those 4 words were, the ones that supposedly wiped the confidence clean off my father's face, so he wasn't even there to hear them. Theo pieced it together weeks later from a colleague who'd been at an industry mixer where my father, in an unguarded moment, had tried to reference a family connection to Margaret Ellison's firm to a prospective client. According to the colleague, Margaret happened to be nearby, overheard the phrase, and said simply, loud enough for the people around him to hear, "We have no connection." 4 words. Not cruel, not raised in volume, just precisely, devastatingly accurate, delivered by the one person whose good opinion my father had spent years trying to manufacture, and delivered because he'd tried to borrow, secondhand and after the fact, a relationship he'd had no part in building, one that existed only because a lonely 11-year-old girl in a gray coat had been fed sandwiches in a supply closet by a man he'd once called an embarrassment. I think about that sentence sometimes, "we have no connection," and how much weight it carries once you understand everything underneath it. My father had wanted proximity to power his entire career. What he got instead was proof, delivered by the person he wanted most to impress, that he had never actually understood what power was built from in the first place. Grandpa still keeps peppermints in his pocket. He still refuses to talk about that night as anything more than a nice surprise, which is the closest thing to bragging I have ever gotten out of that man in 28 years. He still asks me, every single time I see him, whether I'm eating enough, whether Theo is treating me right, whether I need anything, in that order, exactly the way he always has, as though nothing about that reception changed a single thing about who he actually is. And maybe that's the part that sits with me the most. It didn't change him. him. It only changed what everyone else was finally forced to see. My parents did come to Thanksgiving that year, eventually, after a few more months of careful, half-apologetic phone calls from my mother and a stiff, unspoken truce from my father, who has still, to this day, never once brought up Margaret Ellison's name in front of me. It wasn't a clean reconciliation, and I've stopped expecting one. My mother still occasionally slips into the old register, a comment about someone else's presentation, a flicker of concern about how something might look, but I've noticed she catches herself faster now, mid-sentence sometimes, like a habit she's actively trying to unlearn rather than one she's proud of. My father is quieter around Grandpa than he used to be, less performative, less inclined to fill silences with opinions about custodial work he knows nothing about. I don't know if that's growth or just wariness. I've decided it doesn't matter enough to interrogate. Some doors you leave open a crack and let people decide on their own time how far they want to walk through them. Theo's firm, for what it's worth, never became the connection my father hoped it might. Margaret Ellison retired 18 months after our wedding, quietly, with none of the fanfare her position might have commanded, and the one time my father tried, through an intermediary, to request a farewell meeting, he was told politely that her calendar was full through her final day. I don't think that was a coincidence, and I don't think my father does either, though he's never said so out loud. Grandpa sat at the head of that Thanksgiving table too, the way he always had before any of this started, and my mother, for the first time in longer than I can remember, didn't say a single word about how he smelled, or what he talked about, or who might be embarrassed by his presence. She just passed him the peppermint bowl I'd brought as a joke and said quietly, "You should have some before Hannah eats them all," and Grandpa laughed his old shaking the walls laugh and took one and put it in his jacket pocket instead, the way he always did, saving it, I imagine, for someone who might need it more than he did.